In the previous episode, we talked to Wal Thornhill about how he came across the electric sun concept, and some of the initial changes that he envisaged with the Juergens model. In this episode, we will continue the discussion with Wal Thornhill and discuss the main differences in how the anode and cathode are connected between the two models, and how the galaxy could power this, and the differences between population 1 and population 2 stars. Now also remember that there is a part 1 and part 2 to this whole discussion. This is part 4 of the series. Parts 1 and parts 2 cover Juergens' concept, so if you have not seen those, it is quite relevant to understand, particularly when we talk about the differences, what Juergens' concept was, so you can see those differences. And one of the things also that you mentioned quite a lot in when you talk about the EU model, and particularly looking at Sapphire, is the virtual cathode. Now,
Yes.
Obviously, in the previous episode, we looked at the cathodeless discharge. Can you explain a little bit about what the virtual cathode actually is and what that means?
Yes, there is a diagram. I think it was in the Kronos issue, I think, of Juergens' model. And it shows that at some point in space, beyond the coronal discharge, if you like, there is a double layer formed at the cathode boundary. And the result of that is that you get a kick up in voltage, and then it drops down, and that drop is the cathode drop. And that was what Juergens was working on as being the powering potential for the sun. He then used that as an estimate to estimate that cosmic rays were an indication of the difference in the potential between our sun and other stars. But I think that was incorrect, simply because double layers themselves can accelerate the particles without the presence of a star, and is the reason for a lot of these unexplained gamma ray bursts and all of these things from apparently empty space.
Magic. So if we go back to the Juergens model and comparing it to the EU model, so in Juergens' model, he obviously has like a shell that becomes the sort of virtual cathode where the electrons fall in towards the anode. In the EU model, obviously, we talk about Birkeland currents. So the stars are formed through a Z-pinch, and then at the center of that Z-pinch is where we would find the star. Now the question is, how do those different elements connect to what we see in Juergens' model? So what in your mind would be that virtual cathode in the EU model, and what would be the anode in terms of that structure of the Birkeland current in the EU model?
Yeah, well, in the Birkeland current, there is a voltage difference between the central column and the surrounding cylinders. And it appears that the central column is positive with respect to the surrounding cylinders. There's a voltage difference between each of them. So what happens is that the solar wind actually is a current sheet that goes, once it passes out past the virtual cathode, which actually accelerates those positive ions away towards the first cylinder. When those positive ions reach that cylinder, the cylinder actually is composed of what you might call particle beams, and a number of them. And when those neutral atoms get to that point, anyone that happens to collect an electron at the time when it's orbiting, because they will tend to orbit or change direction inside that once they're either ionized, this is the positive ions we're talking about. If one collects an electron when it's actually orbiting around one of these particle beams and facing back towards the solar system, they will form what they call the energetic neutral atoms, which are then detected by a spacecraft inside the solar system. And that was what the IBEX mission was all about. And so I was hoping to see from that IBIX mission, because I knew about the energetic neutral atoms, that the structure would be that of supernova 1987A, where you have that ring of beads around where the star is or was. So what in effect happens is that the sun produces a more dense plasma connection between the inner column and the first, and in the case of a severe attack of a star, it will project out to the second cylinder and light them up, because your particle density there is sufficient to actually enter the glow mode. And in one of my talks, I actually show the relevance to that diagram I've done, in which you've seen of how I think this was all set up. And I was
That's the one. Just to be clear, that's the one with the multiple columns, with the central one with a star. Yeah, that's the one I'm at the moment trying to animate. So hopefully, when people are watching this, they'll actually see that animation of that happening. Sorry.
Yes. So you can see the sun is actually the focus of the pinch, and the circuit itself is causing the pinch, because wherever the current density is increased, the pinch effect increases. So it's this this equatorial plasma sheet of the sun, which is the connection between its power source down the central column and the return circuit, if you like, of the outer cylinders.
So it's like in Juergens' model, he saw that there were imperfections in the galactic sheet. This would be like an imperfection in a Birkeland current that causes the pinch, and then what we see as the star is actually that sort of a load on the circuit between the outer shells and the inner shells. So
yes, I think I've described it as being like street lights along a highway. The power line follows the highway, and the street lights are loads along that circuit.
So going back to Juergens' model, he obviously and comparing the cathode to the anode. Obviously, the cathode is the electrons. Now, we obviously know within the Birkeland currents there are equally electron shells as well as ion shells. Yeah, that's
sure.
I presume is the idea. Or so at some point where this sort of load occurs within the Birkeland current, so you get the pinch, which causes something to sort of try and connect the two layers across. Mm-hmm. So then you would end up with the parts of the electron current flowing down towards that pinch, and normally they would just kind of flow onwards. But obviously what happens when they reach the pinch is that those electrons would then start, I guess, bleeding out, because normally they would stay, plasma likes to stay where it is. It doesn't like to mix.
Yes.
But here, because you've got like an imperfection, it's almost like it's falling in towards that central point, which is obviously the central column, which is what we see as the star. So those ions then sort of fall inwards towards the star, and maybe one of the things maybe to talk with Don about as well in the future is then what happens to those electrons within the structure of the star itself. But for now, all I want to talk about is the sort of the layers. So those electrons fall inwards, and then at the same time, the ions from effectively that central column bleed out. So you've got a bleeding in and a bleeding out. And the idea, obviously, if we look at the sun, then the solar wind is more in a band, isn't it? It's not like it's 360 degrees in all directions. It's more of a band. So you'd end up with like you're saying, like a torus that moves outwards, but they would at some point intersect that first shell and move outwards. Now, in your diagram, so that I try and understand this correctly, you have one central column and then you have two further out. Now, those two further out, are you seeing that as part of that bigger Birkeland?
Yeah, that's a cross section.
Yeah, so you'd have a much bigger one which has a whole series of these. And we just happen to be on one of those, and there are obviously many of those connecting around the bigger one, and then further out there may be more as well.
Yes, I got all of that kind of information from Tony Peratt when he was part of the team. And he, for instance, said that these particle beams in the ancient sky that was witnessed had certain particular numbers that they favoured, and then over time twos or threes of them would join up and the numbers would change. But 56 was a favourite, and he pointed out that Stonehenge has 56 in the Albury Circle. And 56 appears a lot in ancient depictions of what was going on in the sky. So you can understand the sun is in the same situation, except that all of these filaments and so on surrounding the sun are invisible. It would only be in the case where you were a planetary nebula that any object orbiting that star would see all of this lit up around them. It'd be quite a show.
Yeah, that would be quite a show. I'm also correct in assuming then, if we go back to the structure of the Birkeland current, effectively, if we were to look at the total volume of particles traveling downward, so normally it would just continue onwards, but obviously because you've got this imperfection in that at that point, which creates the star. That means that if we looked at the electrons, then obviously some of those electrons are falling inward. So therefore, the current flow at the other end, in terms of electrons, would be less. And the same with the
diminished, yes.
Yeah, positive ions, but obviously in probably the opposite way, because the electrons will go in one direction and the ions will go in the other direction. Yes. But effectively,
I think you have to look at it, or at least I looked at it as an electrician would. You know, the sun is more positive, despite the fact that that means that it's deficient in electrons. That's really what it's saying. And the entire galaxy is deficient in electrons, and that's something that Juergens put forward as a possible explanation for how do the stars stay alight, because the charge could be neutralized in a flash if it weren't for some continual power supply. And I managed to figure that out by following Halton Arp's work and quasars. But we can talk about that later if you like. So what's happening is that the galaxy itself is attempting to restore charge neutrality after having been born severely electron deficient. And this seems to be some process that we don't know how long it takes, but it may never end because we don't know what the source and sink for the universe happens to be. But it paints a completely different picture of the relationship between different galaxies and quasars and all of these things. You begin to see family connections. And the current that the quasar initially is accepting from the umbilical cord with the active galactic nucleus that ejected it must be considerably more dense, intense than it is as it gets further and further from its parent. So in those early stages, the electrons, as they arrive, polarize the matter in the quasar, and they do that in such a way that as the electrical stress or polarization forces increase, the mass of the electron changes in quantum jumps, which gives rise to the shift in redshift. So all of this fits with Halton Arp's non-expanding universe, which I was very happy with. And it shows that over time, galaxies, you can determine who's the parent and who's the child by their redshifts. For instance, Andromeda is blue shifted with respect to the Milky Way. It's not coming towards us. It's just older than we are, this kind of picture also, well, there's so many aspects of the electric universe that all converge on this, even the explanation for gravity. But if you look at that column, you can see the sun sits in a tiny little sphere inside that column, And the fact that we don't actually notice the column except where it impinges directly on the poles of the sun with those streamers, the jets that you see at the poles. We haven't actually flown over the sun to have a look, but I expect people will be just as intrigued as they have been by flying over Saturn and Jupiter's poles, because what they will be witnessing is a Birkeland current phenomenon, not it's certainly not a spherically symmetrical thermonuclear sun.
But is it also right to sort of think of it in terms of because I mean, obviously we look at the sun as an object, but in effect what we're seeing is a very small part of a much larger object, and really it's understanding the totality of that gives you that picture of how it functions. And just looking at that small spherical thing misleads you into understanding how the whole structure actually works together. So
that's right.
And again, I mean, this is something you've talked about before, is the fact that stars can change their behavior, and that's obviously based on that incoming current.
Yes.
Now, for me, one of the questions is, I mean, obviously we have the huge Birkeland current. So within that Birkeland current, I suppose there could be pulses of, compressions within that plasma that moves along that could cause an increase or decrease. And it sort of comes back to what you said about rhythms and patterns, even within plasma that might exist, and that might cause pulses in that incoming signal. But I presume actually it would occur to both the electrons and the positive column going down the center. And it's the marriage between those two is important, because obviously if you starve the electrons, it doesn't really matter what you do to the positive charges, because you need both in order for the sun to operate. So it's understanding that greater picture of how both fit together.
That's true. Yes,
it's important.
The sun is part of a giant circuit, and every circuit has a resonance. And presumably the resonance that we are in is around that 22-year solar cycle, and nearby stars have similar cycles. So this is a feature of the circuitry, it seems. And the important aspect of this, which Don Scott was able to elaborate on quite well with his diagram of the sun and the magnetic field induced and so on, is that what we're dealing with is a modulated direct current. It's like the old days when I used to play with radios, and you used to have a choke in the power supply to iron out the ripple in the DC power supply. The sun, luckily, has a transistorized method of dealing with those ripples. Red stars don't, so they behave badly quite often. And that was one of the key aspects of the Sapphire experiment, was based on the view from Monty Child's engineering perspective that whatever the model was, it had to be a very stable model for the stars to shine so steadily in the sky and for our sun to shine so steadily, even when we know that in X-rays and that the sun is a variable star and almost goes out in X-rays at the low point in the solar cycle, and is quite bright in X-rays at the peak.
Which all comes back to this current that powers it, and the modulation in that current.
Yes.
And therefore,
they could be Alfvén waves too. That's a possibility in that main
column.
Circuit.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot that we don't understand about how plasma operates. A lot of phenomena that it's just not taken into account in modern cosmology.
Yes. I think that's an aspect of the electric universe that I've always recognized, is that it's impossible for any one person to encompass the whole subject.
Yeah.
That's why I've always shared what I thought I knew at any given time, with the hope that somebody would come up and say, I've got an idea, and show a better way of explaining things.
It's like fractal, I think. The more you look at it, the more connections you can see, and I don't think it's ever possible to see the whole picture, because the more you zoom out, the
right.
more questions you have. Like you said, like
Yeah.
where's the sink and where's the source? You know,
when you realise that I had to deal with particle physics as well as the cosmological aspects, plasma cosmology, which is complex enough on its own. The job is, and I think cosmology should be a generalist subject, not a specialist one. It's too broad and vast. It has to be the umbrella for all the other sciences. Well, how can it be so if you've got experts in one particular tiny field?
Yeah, yeah, it's madness. Going back to Juergens' model, so in Juergens' paper, he also talked about the fact that effectively the sun and to some extent the planets, but let's focus on the sun, would become more negative over time, obviously due to the in-streaming of electrons. Is that still the case in the EU model, or is the connection to these Birkeland currents a different mechanism for dealing with those sort of stray particles?
No, I think the very fact that the entire galaxy is trying to restore neutrality continually means that we are part of that system, and therefore we will be looking for electrons to restore whatever the initial state was.
But surely some of those electrons will end up becoming neutral particles in the sun.
Oh, yes.
So,
yes,
to some extent, you can cancel some of that out. And that's my question in terms of that connection to that central Birkeland current. If there are, ions that flow through the sun, then some of those ions could be replenished through that central column, particularly considering as some of those particles become neutralized and become, a neutral material around the surface of the sun. So that, in my mind, it wasn't necessarily quite as in Juergens' model. There is no escape for those particles; they just keep building up. But obviously, in the EU model, there is more of an interconnectedness.
That's right. It's a circuit. It's not a dead end.
Yeah. Well, particularly again, going back to your diagram with the different columns, you obviously have the positive charges coming out from the sun, the solar wind, as they call it, which then meets electrons and forms these neutral particles. Yes. Those neutral particles then, over time could form, gas clouds, which then can become ionized, which then could then form. So it's like a recycling of the material in a completely different way to current cosmology, which requires supernova explosions to generate this material here. But actually, ironically, we know that the sun does this anyway. So this material is being spewed out. So there, and even in the classic model, that material being spewed out by the sun is charged. So it is already throwing charged material. So even in the classic mainstream model, we should be getting more and more charged material building up outside of the stars anyway. But that's kind of beside the point, really. Let's just have a look. So the last thing I kind of want to talk about today is one of the things that when I looked at Juergens' paper, I thought, why is that? So there's the difference between the population 1 and the population 2 stars. And obviously he did what I thought was a brilliant piece of analysis in his paper, where he looked at the effectively that the population 2 stars were only located sort of in the center of the galaxy and in globular clusters, and that the population 1 stars tended to be further out in the sort of disk of the galaxies. But that the connection that other people hadn't made was the dust. So dust prevalent in the outer disk and pretty absent in that central region. And therefore his view is that population 2 stars effectively didn't have the limitations that the population 1 stars had in terms of that electron flow. And that then got me thinking, that's a really nice piece of analysis. But then why is it that all of those stars are red? Because if you look at the, in his, he talks about the fact that population 2, they're all red. The brightest ones are indeed brighter than the largest, red supergiants. So they're significantly bright, but not quite as bright as the largest blue giant stars of the population 1. And that got me thinking, well, why would that be? And I saw, Don's answer in the paper, which kind of comes from his book, to do with the current flow. But that doesn't match, what Juergens said in terms of electron availability. And that made me think, so the idea that I had was to do with, and I forget what the guy's name is. He wrote a paper on plasma redshift. I think he's a Russian guy. I'll put the link down in the description for people. I've talked about it before, but effectively it's to do with electron density, and the availability of electrons can cause a shift towards the red for light. And he looks at the sun, and he does quite a few calculations and based on certain models. And when I looked at sort of his Juergens' paper, I kind of thought, well, if we look at where population 2 stars live, that is, according to him, a high electron density. So therefore, you would expect in those environments for the light to be shifted more to the red, because there are significantly more electrons than there would be in the outer rim. So therefore, you would see them as red, even though they're not red by character. They're red by the effect of the material around it. So that was my sort of idea around explaining it. It doesn't necessarily explain why they're not as bright, but it certainly goes, I think, some way to explaining the redness. I wondered if you had any thoughts on the difference between population 1 and population 2.
It was funny. Charles Bruce actually felt the opposite of Juergens, that the arms had little dust, and therefore there were plenty of electrons to light them, and the central regions were dusty, and therefore they were redder. As for their brightness, that might be due to their size. The mass and size relationship doesn't have any real grounding at all. In fact, I pointed that out some years ago, and they discovered a red dwarf which appeared to put out twice the amount of light it should. And they said, it must be a binary pair, identical twins. Yeah. And I thought, God, blimey, anyway. So I think that's possibly an answer. The other thing is that the galaxy itself, the central region, will be the most positive. In other words, it's the most electron deficient part of the galaxy. So if anything, it's lacking in the electrons. And then what the stars do is they expand their anode sheath in order to try and collect enough electrons, and that could give them great size and redness.
But the upshot is we don't actually know. So where Juergens wrote about the electron, it was his speculation based on sort of what he thought.
But if it was dusty, you would expect that we would have obscuration problems and so on, I think. The other aspect of all of this is we have to look at the boxy nature of some of the barred spirals. The bar itself and its shape is not explained gravitationally. I think it is an aspect of the actual main Birkeland current driving the center of the galaxy. And I haven't actually, I've thought about this, but I haven't come up with any conclusions at all. But I think the one where we look at the center of the galaxy as being most electron deficient, this is why the spiral arms are trying desperately to feed electrons in, then it may explain both the brightness and the redness based on, the standard model of a red star.
Yeah, so that's coming back to what we've already covered in terms of it expanding its shell to try and capture more and more electrons. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Wal. Thank you for your time.
That's all right.
I think we'll follow this up in terms of I think there are many more aspects that I would like to sort of delve into the depths. And I think, as you suggested, it would be a good idea to get Don involved when we look at the. I think for me the next part is to look at the structure of the sun. So trying to expand on looking some of the phenomena that we see and explaining how in the EU model, how that Juergens model has been taken forward to explain how that incoming current connects internally in the sun, and how therefore we see the structures that we see in terms of the solar winds, sunspots and flares. And I think for all of these, they're going to spawn more detailed videos, because I think there's a lot there's a lot in there to explain for people to try and understand.
Yeah, you can easily do a 5-minute video just on sunspots alone. I actually, in this the notes that I'll send you, I include something on sunspots because I've had a view of what they were from very early on, and the evidence that we have supports that. So it's quite simple.
Yeah, that's the idea. That's kind of pulling away, so you see the layer beneath it.
Yeah, but what it actually is an electric discharge from the plasmoid that surrounds the sun, and it's been imaged in UV by SOHO. And Hans Selfane said that the energy in these plasmoids around a magnetized sphere store energy, and then they get to a critical point when they discharge to the body of the sun, and depending on the driving voltage, the latitude changes. So that ties in with this sunspot cycle and the big resonant circuit. And the Birkeland currents, when they strike the sun, one of the reasons that you can pretty much say it's a Birkeland current is that the same polarity sunspots tend to draw together. In other words, the like poles are not pushing each other apart. They're held together by the Birkeland current forces. And the other thing is, inside the umbra of the sunspot are what they call umbral dots, which are hotter than the granules on the surface, which is more like the kind of effects we see in the lightning in the upper atmosphere of the Earth, where you get higher radiant temperatures. You get, the higher up you get, the energy is just that much higher. And also, as the atmospheric density increases, what you get is filamentary lightning, and no longer the more diffuse plasma structures.
Yeah. I think, as you said, there's so much detail to go into. Yeah, it never ends. In the next part, we will delve into the details of the sun itself. In order to do this, we will be talking to both Wal Thornhill and Don Scott, and we will cover how the incoming current connects below the surface and examine some of the surface features and how they can be explained. We will also examine the various bits of data that have been collected about our solar environment and see how these could support this concept. If you are interested in the full version of the discussion that I had with Wal, this will be available for all of my Patreons on my Patreon page. If you are interested in becoming a Patreon, then please see the link in the description for that. Without this support, it would not be possible to create these videos, so a massive thank you to all those who support this channel through Patreon and those that make direct donations via PayPal. As always, be brave, be curious, the truth is waiting for us. Until next time.